Okay, we'll just keep going down. Taylor? If you're talking, you're muted.
Kind of fun.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now. Can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry. I have to call in on my phone because my mic on my laptop doesn't work with Zoom for some reason.
That's okay. We're just happy you joined us.
Thank
And
you.
hopefully we can all meet in person one day.
I agree.
It's all the people come up.
Coralie? Okay, how about Jason? Are you there? I never got your connection.
Was
Might
my
have-
we're supposed to have
Can you see me?
yeah.
I can't see anybody.
Okay, well, then there's one that says course 13 Highland 30th. That's just cheating. There's no way I can come up with a name from that.
That's me. My name is Craig Clyde,
Okay,
and I'm glad to be here.
well, we're glad to have you. Let's see who all. And then I've got an iPhone with a number, 801-440.
So touch it next.
Yeah, Chris, it's me. Dave Lyon.
Okay. Let's see who we haven't seen yet. We're still trying to connect with Jason.
He is trying to unmute. Hold on.
Oh, somebody has a really bad echo.
Yeah, two people must have computers set up next to each other or something.
That could be us.
That's you.
That's us. Okay.
I'll silence one.
Just want to turn your audio off.
You just did.
Okay. Yep. Now you sound good.
Okay.
Sorry.
We still have a couple hopping on. Is there anybody whose name I haven't said that we can hurry and see who you are? Otherwise, I
Unmuted?
don't think I got Eric on here. Eric, did you join us just barely? Eric Clegg?
Yeah, I just jumped on.
Okay. And you can hear and see everything okay?
Yeah.
Oh, Krishna, I haven't seen you in forever.
Hey, hi everyone. How is everyone doing?
Okay, looking through. Robbie, I don't think I had you introduced, did I?
Probably not.
Okay, have you joined us before?
Not online.
Okay,
I have other places.
okay. Well, I think we are probably good to go. I'm going to ask everybody to remute yourselves after I had you unmute so that we don't get any feedback. And I know we'll have more joining us as we go. We're going to ask that you just kind of save your questions for the very end. I'll watch the chat window and see if there's anything that we need to address. But we're going to go through the presentation and then Karen's open for questions as long as you want to ask them or something like that. I think she said she'd stay up all night if she had to. Isn't that what you said,
All
Karen?
night. I've got my water, I've got my treats, I'm good to go.
Oh, she's good to go. Okay. Then I'm going to. We are so happy that Karen volunteered to do this. We all admire her flower photography. I think you might be one of the original members, aren't you, Karen? I think you've been.
You know, I think I'm probably one of the original members that's basically a ghost. I thank heavens for the Facebook page because I try to keep up with the Facebook, but after I joined, I realized that the regular meetings were on the same night as another commitment that I had that I just didn't feel I could not go to that commitment. And then for whatever reason, I've been to a few of the outdoor shoots, but not as many as I would have liked. And then we up and moved down to St. George. So I was
So
one
now
of the
you get to
original
make
members.
You get to make us jealous of your flowers all year round instead of just
Yes.
6 months of the year, like the rest.
Well, actually, I wish it were so, but there really aren't too many flowers in the wintertime. But the good news is you can at least go out and not freeze to death, usually.
Yeah, you guys had more snow last week than we did, just for the record.
Yeah, I know. And a few days you've been warmer up there than we have, which is, then I can't tease my friends who live up there when that happens.
Okay, well, Karen, I'm just going to turn it over to you. And
Okay, that's great. I will carry on. And like Chris said, if it's kind of, I've got a good hour and a half without comments. And so I know people may have other things to do, or maybe don't want to sit that long. So like Chris said, if you could mute yourself so we don't get background, and I'll go through my presentation. But the last time I did this, I had lots of questions. And so I'm happy to answer whatever you want to know. And the other thing I just want to mention before I forget, as at the end of the presentation, there'll be the last screen will have my email address. I've got some pretty extensive notes that actually are written down. So don't try to, if you see something that you want to remember and you're frantically trying to write it down or take a picture with of the screen with your phone, you probably don't need to do that, because if anybody who emails me, I will be happy to send you a copy of my 9-page notes that will have almost everything I talk about on it. So with that, I've given a presentation on flower photography for several years, and what I find is, just as a brief introduction, that everybody loves flowers, and no matter what genre of photography is your specialty, I think a lot of us just can't resist when we see beautiful, colorful, wonderful flowers to take pictures of. And I always maintain that no matter what our skill level is, or our abilities, or our physical abilities, flowers are always something that you can find of interest if you are looking for ways to make your flowers interesting rather than just a snapshot. I mean, if you're healthy and fit and young, you can tramp up mountains and take pictures of wildflowers in the middle of nowhere. And if you're not quite so fit, you can take pictures in your neighborhood. And frankly, if you don't even want to go outside, you can do some really artistic and interesting things right in your house with bouquets of flowers you pick up at the grocery store. So it's kind of a universal thing. So I want to talk, if everybody will bear with me, I want to spend about five or 6 minutes talking about a few things that I think are even more important than the flowers that the flower photography we're going to talk about. And there won't be any pictures right now while I talk about some of these things. But I think that what I want to talk about now is probably more important. Oh, I forgot to talk about this. So I want to tell you what we're going to go through tonight. We're going to learn about how to critique your own images. And the size of the fonts tells you how much time I'm going to spend on each of these areas. We're going to talk about what equipment and technical information you need to learn for flower photography. The majority of time is we're going to go through lots of pictures that we're going to critique and talk about what makes them good, what makes them mediocre or not good. And so we're going to discuss ways that will help you increase your artistic abilities and talents in order to make your photography more creative and interesting. So this is going to be a night of creativity, not technical information. And then we're going to put it all together. But the first thing I want to talk about before we actually get into looking at pictures is for all of us to want to decide if you're taking pictures snapshots that you just love and they bring you joy and you don't care if they're good or bad or if anybody else likes them or not, then you're good to go and you can sit back and relax. But if you look at your pictures and you say, you know, this isn't what I had in mind, it's not very interesting, or I wish this were better, or you see somebody else's pictures and you say, wow, why don't my pictures look like that? Then this is what we're going to talk about tonight. So what that means is we're all looking to create images with what I call have the wow factor. So, and here's my definition of what one of those type of images would be. A great image is one that draws the viewer in and makes him want to take his time and look a bit longer. The longer a viewer looks at, thinks about, and enjoys your photo, the more interesting and better it is. And you know how that goes when you're thumbing through your Facebook page or your other media. You know, you'll just skip over and over and over, and then all of a sudden something draws your attention and you stop and look at that a little more, so a little longer. So that means a great photo must have something extraordinarily beautiful, unique, compelling, exciting, thought-provoking, or tell a story the viewer can relate to, or elicit an emotional response, or have a dynamic composition or amazing light. You get the idea. There's got to be something unique to draw attention. So then you have to just, and this is for any type of photography. Flowers, it's a little bit harder to do, but it's very doable, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So how do you know if your photo has the wow factor? So one thing that I want to touch on is to be aware of being too emotionally attached to your image to honestly analyze and critique it objectively. So I want to give you a couple of examples of what I mean, because I want you to get in your mind how you can look at an image, and that will depend on, and that goes from the very beginning, how you're composing it in the field, what you see about that image that makes it look interesting or unique, clear up to maybe how you edit it when you put it on your computer, all through the process. So I want to tell you I'm going to show you two of my photos. I'm going to say, this is my joke of the night, that I have won an award, either first or second place in every photo contest I've ever entered. That being said, I will tell you I've only entered 2, and I'm not going to enter any more contests because I don't want to ruin my record of winning. So there we go. That's my tell-all. So every year, for those of you in Utah probably know that up at Thanksgiving Point, they have an annual tulip festival, runs a week and a half, 2 weeks, something like that. And I lived 5 minutes away from Thanksgiving Point, so I would go every year, of course, and I'd go numerous times during the festival. And for a few years, they had a contest, and they would choose 12 winners, and then a grand winner, and they would create their yearly Thanksgiving calendar from those photos from the tulip festival, and the winner's cover was on the front, and that was this picture. So here's my thought. This didn't dawn on me until years later, but what dawned on me years later was that here you've got a bunch of judges looking at photos of tulips, all beautiful colors, sizes, types, whatever. So why would this picture stand out from all of the beautiful tulips they were looking at? I think it stood out because it was different. This year there was a painter there every day I went, and I don't know if she was commissioned by Thanksgiving Point to do pictures or what, but she looked kind of official, and she was there every time I went, and I got used to seeing her. And so for whatever reason, I just took a picture of her painting the tulips. And my guess is that was a different picture, something unique that the judges saw. Here's another picture, has nothing to do with flowers, but it's got a fun story to it. We spent 18 months in New Zealand, and in New Zealand, which of course is the photography capital of the world, every year they have an entire month in the Auckland area devoted to photography. They have art galleries, and famous photographers come and give lectures and workshops and all sorts of things. And one day out of that month, they have a photo contest, and it's open to amateurs and professionals. And the only criteria, and the theme is supposed to be how I spent my day in Auckland. And the only criteria for the photos that you submitted was that the photo has to be taken on that very day. It couldn't be one of your best photos from 10 years ago. So we were there for two of those photo contests. And the first one, I just went out just for fun. It was on a Saturday, and took a bunch of pictures, and mostly of the beautiful scenery and just the gorgeousness that is New Zealand. And I submitted them, but of course didn't win anything. But later on, when I looked at the winners, I noticed that their theme was taken literally. Every photo that won had, some did have landscapes, but every photo that won had people in it, which of course was how I spent my day in Auckland. And so the next year when I went out in the morning, I was getting my camera equipment ready to go, and my husband was in bed, and I was walking in the hallway, looked in our bedroom, and this was what I saw. And the poor guy, that was such a damp area there that he had a real trouble keeping his feet in order. But this is what I saw. And with that blue sky, which was a window right over our bed, it was just a funny picture. And I took it just to show him later on. But I don't know, when I went through my pictures, there was something about it that I just liked. So I submitted that picture to the photo contest, and I won second place out of 1,500 entries. The thing that was interesting about it was when the judge called me to tell me that I had won, after she told me I'd won, the next thing she says is, "You have got to tell me about that picture." We, meaning the judges, kept coming back to your picture after going through 1,500 pictures because we couldn't figure it out. Is the guy sick? Is he dead? Do his feet hurt? Tell me why you took that picture. So the moral of all of this that I want to impress on your minds is, like the other picture and this picture, if you want your pictures to stand out and create a wow image, you have to look at them critically and find out and think of what is it about this picture that makes it stand out. In other words, would an experienced portrait photographer judging a baby contest pick your photo out of 1,000 other baby photos she's looking at and say, wow? Or would an experienced nature photographer judging a tulip festival contest look at your tulip and say, wow, is that unique or is that different? Somebody judging sunsets, would they think your sunset is different or unique, or do you just think it's the most amazing sunset because you happen to be there with your bride or groom on your honeymoon, and that's why it was? So that's the thing that I want to impress upon you tonight, is that you're going to use your creativity and your artistic abilities to find something unique that goes over and above being colorful or good lighting or great exposure, something that is unique that makes your pictures stand out. So just briefly, here's just some ways that you can help yourself analyze your images with honesty that's unbiased. Look at the images of photographers you admire with a critical eye and decide what you like about their styles and what attracts you to their images. Look at your work with a critical eye and imagine how it would stand out to a judge looking at 1,000 other images with the same subject. Enter your best images in photo contests. Pick a mentor in your community or photo club and ask for constructive input. Submit a portfolio of your best work to a professional photographer for critique. Develop a tough skin. When asking for an honest critique, have the wisdom to consider the input and not be offended by suggestions that might improve your work. And like probably some of you do, post your photos on Facebook or Instagram, Flickr, 500 pixels, whatever media you like. And then you will have some instant feedback by the number of comments or the number of likes you have. Okay, so that's what I want to say about that. Now I'm going to say something. I don't know how many techies we have out there compared to artists. But as I had a hobby of photography for many years, I noticed there's three kinds of photographers. There's those people that are really technical people who are drawn to photography. They know every possible button and shutter speed and everything that their camera can possibly do, and they often have the best equipment and the best skill in Photoshop and all of those things. Those are the techies. And then you have the artists like myself who sees compositions and who only does the technical stuff when they're forced to make their compositions a reality. And then you see those lucky people that are a good combination of both. But I want to say something now that might be offensive to you techies out there, but bear with me. I would like you to consider the importance of artistic vision even over technical skill. And I'm going to spend about 1 minute on this. Vincent Versace said that emotionally full and technically imperfect trumps technically perfect and emotionally vacant every time. Let me say that again. Emotionally full and technically imperfect trumps technically perfect and emotionally vacant every time. So what does that mean? That means that a photo can have the wow factor even if it's not technically perfect. So I want to tell you a quick story. I had the privilege quite some years ago of taking a week's workshop with Joel Sartori, who is a longtime National Geographic photographer. And if any of you are interested in animal photography, he has an ongoing project now called the Photo R that you might want to look up. His goal is to portrait photograph all endangered species of animals. But anyway, to emphasize this point, when we were in this workshop, there was an interesting situation. He was showing us some of his pictures, and he stopped at one of his pictures that everyone in the class was just riveted to. He lived in Nebraska and used to take pictures of the local rodeos. And he said he would get right up in there in the action, and he'd always have a helper stand right behind him, holding onto his shirt tails to yank him back if he got too close. But this picture was just mesmerizing. He was just right. It looked like he was a foot away. The cowboy was, as I can remember in my mind, I wished I had a picture of it. The cowboy was down in the dirt. The bull who had just thrown him off was inches away from his face. There was snot and blood flinging all over. And one of his horns was just right at his head. And we were all just, what a shot. Well, as we were all sitting there, there wasn't, you could hear a pin drop in the room. This guy raised his hand and waved his hand, and Joel called him and he says, I know what's wrong with this picture. And we all looked at him like, what are you talking about? He says, well, if you look over the arena, if you look at the horizon line's crooked. Well, we all just were stunned because, not one of us had even noticed the horizon because the emotional impact of that picture was so great. So that's what I am referring to when I'm saying that you may not have the technical skill that you would like to have, but if you have an artistic vision that draws people in, that will be equal and more important. Plus, in my humble opinion, improving your composition and creative skills will improve your photography more than improving your technical skills, because when you are driven by the vision of an amazing image you want to produce, you will figure out what you need to learn on the technical side to create that vision. And that's my story. I've been using Photoshop probably since the year it was invented. I probably know one scintilla of what Photoshop can do. I've never had a camera that I actually know everything it can do, because I don't care about that until there's something that I see in a composition that I want to create. And then I know I've got to go figure out the technical skills to get it done. Okay, what camera equipment and are required? Very simple. Whatever you currently have. Like I said earlier, you can have the most, oh, I forgot to say the end of that Joel Sartori story. The guy that raised his hand and made that comment, interestingly enough, was the one that had $10,000 worth of the most expensive camera and professional lenses. And consistently, he'd give us an assignment in the afternoon, and then in the morning we would pick our 2 or 3 best pictures, and he'd put them up on screen, and then we'd critique them all. And he was consistently the guy that had the worst pictures. So that just an interesting side note there. And I can tell you that you can take amazing flower photography with your iPhone or your $5,000 Canon or Nikon, whatever you have. The trick is you have to know the limitations of what you're using and then create your compositions around those limitations. And of course, so optional, whatever you want to rent and whatever you can afford to buy. So one other thing, and then we're going to start looking at pictures. We're going to talk mostly about developing an artistic eye. And we're not going to talk per se about any photography rules except right here. We will mention some briefly as we go through our pictures, but this is about creativity and artistry. And these are the only 2 rules that are critical for you to remember. And these are also from Joel Sartori when I took this class, and he mentioned this numerous times. So are you ready for these 2 critically important rules? Rule number 1, there are no rules. Rule number 2, refer to rule number 1. So this means that it's good to know the basic 101 rules of photography, but if they work for your composition, great. But if they don't work for your composition, you need to throw them out. Okay, so now to pictures. The first thing we're going to talk about, if I can get it to go, which it's not. What's happening here?
Hey, Karen, can I interrupt you for just a second?
Absolutely.
Barbara's trying to get, I think Barbara's trying to ask a question.
No,
Well,
you
it may
okay?
not.
Are you okay, Barbara? You got it okay?
I can't get. I am sorry to interrupt. Sorry.
Chris, while she's trying to do that, did you turn off sharing with me? Because my presentation is not working either right now.
You're on my screen still.
Yeah, but I can't forward or backward in any way for some reason.
I haven't touched any of that.
Okay.
Carrie or someone, can you reach out to Barbara via cell phone and see if you can help her? Okay, I'm muting myself again, Karen.
Okay, maybe I have to click. Let me see if it goes back. Okay, let's hope that I'm working now. So the first thing we're going to talk about is lighting. And obviously, as photographers, we all know that lighting is the foundation not only for great flower images, but for any type of photography. But if you're a nature or a landscape photographer, often you will hear people say, well, early morning, late evening, dawn, dusk, those are the times that sunset, sunrise, sunset, and then you may as well hang up your camera during the middle of the day. That may be true for lots of kind of outdoor photography, but it is not true for flower photographers. So I'm going to, this part, I'm going to show you the different types of lighting that work well for flower photography. The key, once again, is to know what your composition is and where your lighting is coming from. So we all know that the light, well, maybe we don't, but I will say, the very best lighting for flowers is a lightly overcast day when the light is soft and even. That's pretty much ideal because you've got small parts and deep shadows on petals and stamens and interesting centers are very distracting. So anytime you have an overcast day where that may not be good for a landscape where you want a beautiful sky to show, an overcast day is great for flower photography. And here's just a couple of pictures for you just to notice how soft and there's no shadows. The light is still bright. It's like a big light box. The sky becomes a big light box when it's a lightly overcast day. There's another case where the flower itself has virtually no shadows on the leaves. This one has a little bit of shadow, if you can see, kind of over on the between the stamen and the petals and kind of in the back petals, but not enough to be distracting. Other times that you can take pictures for flowers, and you'll know when I'm finished that covers every type of lighting condition. Dawn, of course, is great for flower photography. You might have to use a fast shutter speed or a tripod if it's dark. Sunrise is a great time for flower photography. That's when the sky is warm, and that will create a warm feel to your flowers. Middle of the day, I want to talk about middle of the day. Middle of the day, if you're doing a vista image like this, is hard, but you can do it. This was taken in the middle of the day. You have to find a composition where deep shadows are hidden. And in this composition, the sun is a bit behind me, so the deep shadows are behind those rocks. So you don't see deep shadows. The lighting might be a little bit harsh, but nevertheless, it's possible to take good photos even in the middle of the day. Here's another one in the middle of the day, and I threw this in because sometimes the deep shadows aren't distracting. They can maybe even add, and because usually the light in the middle of the day is bland. It's not directional, and so it's flat. But here, the shadow in there kind of sets off the smaller flowers in the front, so that it actually adds a little bit of a background to them. So in this case, I don't particularly think that midday shadow is distracting. I want to tell you another incident. This was taken at Milford Sound in New Zealand, where all the fjords are. Middle of the day, as you can see, bright, and we were at a typical tourist spot. The tourist spot, if you're me photographing this scene, the tourist spot was at my back, and there were a ton of people at the tourist spot trying to take pictures, and the picture was a glacier. Well, in the middle of the day, that glacier was harsh and bleached out and just white. There was just no picture there. And I was going to take a picture just to say I'd been there. But then I happened to turn around, and the lighting was such that I saw this scene, and it was still very bright, but there was this small little patch of lupin against those craggy mountains, and that was my picture that I took, that I loved far better than the picture that all the tourists were taking, where the light was just glaring right on the glacier. And so just a reminder that if you are in tourist places, don't think that's because somebody decided was the tourist shot to take. You can take that one, but turn around and look behind you or look other places, and you might find better photo ops than the actual photo op that people think is the best one. You can back to the lighting. Gloomy days are great. If the sky has some definition in it and some interesting clouds, you can take pictures with flowers in your foreground and include the clouds. Obviously, if the clouds had just been a white upper high bland, I would never have included the sky in this picture. You can take clouds on darker days when this does have a sunset, but as you can see, it was a dark, cloudy days, but that gave it some a kind of a mood. This was taken almost in the same spot. This was either a little earlier or later, and it was a brighter day. You can take beautiful flower pictures when it's dark after the sun is already down and you've just got your twilight there. And my favorite thing to do in this case is to find the direction of the brightest light coming in and then find flowers that you can stand behind and have them backlit, particularly when they're small flowers like this. This would not have been a good picture at all if I couldn't have taken this from behind them so that the flowers were kind of neon standing out against that dark background. There's another one that you can take, another one that I took late. This one I did, I will talk a little bit about this later, but I rarely use tripods. Hinders your creativity, and when you're down low like flowers are, pretty hard to set up tripods and get all the unique angles you can get when you're trying to take pictures of flowers. But even dark scenes take pretty flower pictures. The blue hour takes beautiful you can take beautiful pictures during the blue hour, either before sunset, no, after sunset or before sunrise. So while you're, no matter what time, what your lighting is during the day, a couple other things to think about when you're concentrating on the lighting. Your subject should be the lightest, brightest element in your photo if you want it to stand out. So just notice in the next few photos how the background is there and it's interesting, but your eye is drawn to the lightest part of the picture. This one's a little more subtle. But if you notice, I have to take a drink there. But if you notice the center of that, it's not a flower and it's not a weed. What is that? Whatever it is. And the ladybug, they are lighter than the surrounding part of that frame. One of my favorite types of lighting to look for is if you're out in the garden and you're around foliage and trees and that, you'll often, and the sun is out, you'll often see a beam of light shining on one flower. And that's one of my favorite types of compositions because it makes that flower look like it's glowing from inside, and it sets it apart from the rest of your composition. These were just some little wildflowers. I was out at Whitney Pockets down in Nevada, and I was taking a picture of the sunset. The sun was just ready to set, and I looked down at my feet because I knew there were some little flowers down there, and I didn't want to step on them. But these little flowers were just perfectly lit by the sun. And so that was that. Here's just another one of where a ray of sun is just skimming on one flower. That one's at Thanksgiving Point. This one is a little less obvious, but if you notice, the main part of that, the center of that flower is the brightest, with some of the light spilling off into some of the outer petals. Backlighting, back to more backlighting, and that's also one of my favorite things to do. With certain flowers, it really makes them stand out. Daffodils is one of them. A lot of people dislike backlighting, and we'll talk about sunflare in a minute, but that's kind of one of my favorite things, because why? It's unique. Most of the time you don't see sunflares and backlighting on flower photography, so that's one of my favorite things to do. Side lighting, once again, shows silhouettes, shows the prickles, the spines on that cactus, as well as the main part of that cactus bloom. Here's another one that's I like even better, where the side lighting is tickling the tips of the center part of that stamen there and makes for unique lighting. Here again, just another picture of some daffodils backlit. sun flare. This was taken in Death Valley, and it was hot, and I wanted it to look hot and like Death Valley would look. So I purposefully let it blow out, let the lighting blow out part of the scene to give that feel. There's another one that has it all. It has backlighting, it has sun flare, it has bokeh. We'll go back to that. We'll talk a little bit about bokeh later on, but just something else to make an image look a little more interesting. Back to lighting. Foggy and misty days are great to take photos of flowers. It increases the colors, saturates the colors, and gives kind of a dreamy effect on pictures. So if you're up for going out when it's foggy and cold, then that's you could very well be rewarded with some great images. Another thing that I like to do that a lot of people don't realize is you can create, just if you find a composition that is close to a wall or a house, and the sun is just slightly behind that wall, it creates very dramatic flower pictures. The sun here was behind this picture is a brick wall, but you can't see it because it's rendered black, because the sun is bright, it's focusing on the flowers, and creates a very dramatic type picture. If you can find a situation here, this is another one. This is the side of my neighbor's house. So the background is literally a house that you can't see because the sun was behind the house, but it was still shining on the cactus. Once again, dark backgrounds. If you're in a deep forest or deep woods, this was taken up at Cedar Breaks, that always creates a lovely picture to have a dark background. But your flower, this is another example of a day when there were absolutely no shadows. If there are shadows, and it's a horrible sense of lighting, this is not the best picture, and I couldn't find the one I was looking for when I made this presentation, but use it in a composition. Find a shadow and find a way a creative way to use a shadow in a composition. Bokeh, I'm not going to go into a lot about bokeh, but for those of you who don't know what bokeh is, if you can see how that background is creamy and creates circles, your certain lenses and the aperture you put your lenses at, and the way the sunlight hits your lens can often create beautiful bokeh. Once again, this is a personal thing. Some people don't like it. I love bokeh because it's different and unusual. There's one with smaller bokeh. The light is filtering through trees, and so spots of light turn into big light globes that add. I'm not going to talk much about this, but also know that there is all sorts of lighting that you can use to take great flower pictures. You can use your flash, you can use fill flash, you can use a flashlight, moonlight, ring light, any type of lighting source, artificial light, you can use to help you highlight your subject and what you're trying to do with composition. Light modifiers, neutral density filters, polarizers, light box, reflectors, circular flash, scrims, all those fancy things you can use, but you don't need to use any of them. And I can tell you on all of these pictures, I'm trying to look here at my notes, on all the pictures you're going to see here, I have not used any artificial lighting. I've not used reflectors, I've not used light box, I've not used scrims, I've not used anything. The only thing I've used is natural blockers, like if I have a wall to block something, or myself, I will use my body to block light, and I do use a polarizer filter on my lens. But other than that, I don't use anything else. You do have to be careful of too much white dappled light is distracting. So look at your composition and make sure you don't have big blocked out sections of white that distract. This isn't too terrible, and I could have edited those out in Photoshop if I wanted to, but it wasn't that great of an image, so I didn't bother. Here's another one that I want you to look at and see what's wrong with this image. For one thing, the center of your image where you want people to look, which is the most interesting, is about the darkest part of or one of the darkest parts of the image. And then you've got all of those big white blotches around the outside. So at least in my humble opinion, not a great, I like the sharpness of it. I actually like that the light is rimming the outer petals, but it's really not a very good picture as far as I'm concerned. Here's another one. You know what the subject is, but it's dark. What's the main part of that flower? That stamen that sticks out that has all those little balls in it, and it's virtually lost in that busy background with all of those variegated leaves. And once again, if I really like that image, I could have cropped it and drawn that flower closer, but it still had a background that in my opinion was too busy for that flower and too bright for that flower. So this is personal opinion. We do have those bright, I think those are dead petals, those yellow petals. I loved the flower. And those petals aren't bright white, and the flower is so big that most people might think that's just fine. But I didn't particularly like that, so that was my edit of it. I still wanted the background to be interesting, so I didn't want a plain, boring background, but I edited those spots out just because I wanted that flower to take center stage. So the takeaway, talking about lighting, is that you can adapt and use whatever lighting situation you have to create interesting compositions. So you can't use lighting as an excuse for not going out and shooting flowers. That's my point there. So now we're going to talk about 3 components to your flower images that when you are looking at a through your camera and trying to compose a composition, I want you to be aware of 3 components that are important that you should consider. The first, of course, and the main component is the main subject. I think the most dynamic and powerful flower photos are the ones where the viewer's eye is drawn immediately to the main subject. So that means that the main subject in some way should be isolated from the rest of the composition. Maybe it's the largest in size. Maybe the focus is, maybe that's in sharp focus while the rest of the image is in soft focus. Maybe it's where the flower is placed, which is in the foreground and the rest is behind it. But somehow, in some way or ways, the viewer's eye should immediately be drawn to that main subject. Just a couple examples where there's no question of what the photographer, me, wants you to look at when you first look at these pictures. So basically, what I'm saying about the main subject is that most often, not always, but most often, your subject flower should be the sharpest, brightest, lightest, and usually, but not always, the closest element to the camera. That will make the biggest impact. And usually it should hold the largest amount of real estate in the frame. So then we have supporting elements. Supporting elements add areas of interest to an image. So once again, one of the ways to know you have a good image is if your viewer finds interesting things to look at in your frame. One supporting element kind of creates a tension with the main subject. So the idea is when somebody first pulls up this subject, they will immediately be drawn to that foreground flower, look at the interesting details of the center of that flower. But then out of the corner of their eye, they see something bright in the upper right-hand corner. So their eye travels to that and they look at that and they say, oh yeah, that's another flower. Obviously not that great of interest, but it keeps their eye attracted. It keeps them engaged. And then they go back to the main flower. There's another little bit different example, but the same thing. Your eye immediately goes to that main flower. Then you kind of want to see the flowers that are up in that right-hand corner. So there's something else interesting to look at. There's another one. So that's with one additional supporting element. Then you have two supporting elements, which I call the power of three. And this is a great way to compose a flower image. It creates a circle or a triangle for the eye to follow. So the eye doesn't ever go off of the frame. You start with that main subject and then you see another flower and then you see another one and then, well, you come back till you want to recheck out the main flower. So a circle of three, creating a composition that has one main subject and two other interesting elements is always a good composition. Okay, third area. Remember, we're talking about three parts of the flower composition: the main subject, the supporting subjects, and then you have a background. And this is where a lot of photographers in any type of photography fall down. The background really creates the foundation and a backdrop to show off your subject. So if it's so out of focus and a boring color, it adds nothing to the composition. And basically, you've got a lot of that frame that's what? Boring. So keep that flower in mind because we're going to come back to that in a little bit. So, and backgrounds are kind of my thing. I always am interested to find interesting backgrounds. So you can have a background that is totally in focus that makes it more interesting because it gives the context of where that subject flower is and shows the surroundings that flower is in, which makes it more interesting than just that, in my personal opinion. Here again, a lot of this is personal opinion. You can have in focus with a grand vista where even though you still know that the flowers in the foreground are the subject, you can see the location of those flowers and see what is where they are in relation to the background. This was taken near Bryce. This is Snow Canyon right down here. Once again, you can see the flower is the main subject, but you can see where that flower is. It gives it more interest. One of the best backgrounds for flowers is a soft focus. Reason being that flowers have small parts, a lot of little parts. So if you have a background that is really sharply focused, that sometimes can detract from your main flower. But if you have a background that is soft focused, that still is enough for the viewer to see what that background is and the surroundings of the main flower, but it's not sharp enough to detract from your main flower. You can find places where texture will add interest. We'll talk later about adding your own, but these, sometimes you find flowers that are up against walls. This was a wall that just added natural interest to that background. Much more interesting than if that background had just been a blank brown. This was Thanksgiving Point at the Tulip Festival again. And of course, it's early enough in spring that all the shrubbery and the bushes had not leafed out. So that background is actually branches of shrubbery, but it certainly made for a more interesting background than if that had just been plain. So my goal, and I'd like you to consider, is to strive to find an interesting background that will add context to your image, but not be so distracting that it distracts from your subject. Something like this, this was a rainy day, and this was a background that was taken with raindrops and splatters, and I thought that was an interesting background. Here's an image where that moth is kind of boring and the flowers are small and not not too interesting. If that background had just been a solid brown, it would have been a very boring interest. But I had a camera that allowed and had an aperture, and the way I was facing allowed me to create some bokeh on that picture. And I think that at least makes this picture look a little bit more interesting than if it had just been a plain dark background. This was another one taken in front of a fountain. I thought was interesting. This one's a little wilder, but it was in front of a plant that had these pinflower flowers were scattered amongst a plant that had those curlicue, whatever those are. And I thought that was interesting. Caution, again, is your backgrounds. You can't go crazy with backgrounds, because if they're too busy, then they detract. I really love this background. And frankly, if that main subject flower had been a flower with big petals, I probably would have loved it. But the fact that that main flower has those little itty bitty blooms, I thought was way too busy to have that really busy background. So my takeaway from this is, when you're visualizing your composition, pay attention to those three main components. What's your main subject going to be? Is there a composition where you can include some supporting elements that might add interest? And can you find a composition where your background is also interesting and not either too busy or too boring? Okay, so now we're going to talk about different ideas, just to get your creative juices flowing, just some creative ideas that you can think about while you're out shooting flowers. You can create a mood, and maybe we all know this, but maybe you just don't think about it. You can create a mood with flower pictures. And these things are obvious, but it's just nice to look at them. You can create a mood with color. Obviously, if you're shooting flowers that are red, yellow, orange, and pink, you're probably going to have a happy, joyful image. And I don't think anybody can take pictures of sunflowers without them being happy. On the other hand, if you're taking photos of deep blue or purple or magenta flowers, that's a quiet or maybe a somber looking composition. Your lighting, if your photo is brightly lit, you have bright exposure, sun flare, bright blue sky, that's obviously happy and joyful. Here's another one, backlighting, yellow. Sun flare creates a happy mood. On the other hand, I was out this day when it was really a dark day, and I ran across this composition with these purple flowers. I don't know what they were, but I just saw moody purple with this, and so I purposefully made the exposure dark, and the flowers are soft focus. They're not very sharp, because I was looking to create a somber, quiet mood. This one, I knew it was such a dark day. This is up in Albion Basin, and boy, it was such a dark day. I about wrapped it up, but then I saw these, oh, I lost my mind. What are those? You know what they are. But anyway.
Columbine.
Columbine, that's it, thank you. And I knew that to make this not a really totally dreary picture, I had to get down really close and make those Columbine a big part of the frame, but I still wanted it to look like it was a moody day, which it was. And same thing with your backgrounds, kind of goes along with lighting. If you've got a colorful sky, bright colors in your sky and a bright exposure, you're happy. And if you have no nothing in your background or dark, obviously no detail at all, you can create a quiet, somber image. You can create the illusion of movement. Sometimes this takes a lot of experimenting. I was out during a windy day, and so I knew I wasn't going to get a great sharp picture. So I just was kind of messing around. And this doesn't go along with a lot of what I've told you about your main flower having a lot of real estate in that, but this was just kind of a happy image, and I just kind of liked that there was blurry parts of it, and that the main flower that is there in the center, which goes against something else I'll talk about later. But it did create something kind of interesting with the various lighting and that, which here again, I'm always looking for something that's interesting. Dripping water always gives an illusion of movement if you can slow your shutter speed or not slow your shutter speed. Excuse me. Always makes for interesting pictures with water dripping off of flowers. Reflections in water give the feeling of movement. This was actually taken in Costa Rica. So I'm going to show you, I rarely do this, but once in a while I go wild and crazy. We were visiting our grandkids in Arizona, and we were at that, they have a butterfly wonderland, I think it's called, in Phoenix. And so there were tons of butterflies in this domed building, but wherever those butterflies landed, the backgrounds were horrible. There was nothing, I mean, they were just horrible. So I was trying to get a picture of a butterfly and I was taking, excuse me, I was taking a picture of this guy and the background is horrible, but I looked right next to where he was and there was this flower. Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with my voice. But I guess they must have just watered, because there was this puddle of water in the center of this flower. And I liked all the light swirls and the reflections coming from the ceiling. And so I took a picture of that and used it as a background. And that's the background of that on that butterfly. Once again, caution, too much movement can, boy, I'm having a hard time. Too much movement can overpower your subject, and this is a good example of that. The background is way, way too busy to do that flower any justice, in my opinion. Any type of water can be your best friends. It makes things look soft and muted. Dewdrops, rain sprinkles. Sprinklers are great. I love it when they splash off of the flowers, like in this one, add something of interest. And I had to throw this dramatic one in of weather. This was in New Zealand, and we saw this storm cloud that was way over the horizon, and I kept my eye on it, and it was just coming right toward us. And so when I knew it was going to come right toward us, I frantically looked around for a foreground subject that would do it justice. And you can see by how backlit they are that the sun was shining everywhere brightly, except for that one storm cloud. So anytime you can get inclement weather in your photos, you have a great chance to get some really interesting shots. Like I say, dewdrops, and if you're an avid flower photographer, you most likely, if you're not out when nature provides them, you will carry a squirt bottle with you and create your own. That may be cheating, but that's okay. I won't tell anybody. Dewdrops that sit right on the edge of petals are really interesting. There's a single dewdrop in the middle of a big sunflower that I had in my yard one year. And these aren't flowers, but we were visiting some friends up in Fairview Lakes in early spring, and those leaves were just opening, and it had rained the night before, and there was a perfect drop in each of the centers of those leaves that had that pattern in it. And I thought that was interesting. Here again, sprinklers are really interesting, and you can turn your sprinklers on in your backyard anytime you want. Flowers, if you can find flowers in front of fountains, sometimes they will create the most interesting backdrops for you. Once again, it's easy for them to create, or it's easier when you have drops of water to create bokeh. And so that's what these are. That's the streaming fountain behind that is created. And some of this is just trial and error and being lucky. You know, this is sometimes just being lucky. You take your pictures and you get back home and you look at it on the screen and you go, whoa, look at that. I had no idea that fountain would do that. There's another with a fountain behind. Sometimes if you want a larger vista, you can have the fountain in the picture. That creates smaller bokeh, or you can have it in focus. Creates a different look. It's obviously Temple Square. The one on the left was Thanksgiving Point, and the one on the right is obviously Temple Square, which I understand that fountain. I just learned that they're going to do away with that fountain. Living down here now, I don't get to see what's going on up there in Temple Square much. Shooting down over the water creates a really interesting background sometime, because oftentimes fountain waters are bubbly and moving and creates an interesting background. Or throw a flower in a fountain and see what you get. Snow, anytime in the spring when you have a late spring snowstorm and some of the flowers out is some of the best. This isn't a winter one. I'll show you this one. But is a good time to go out and take pictures, because it's unusual to see snow and ice on spring flowers in most parts of the world. So I always try to head out when there's been a snowstorm that's covering spring flowers. And if you want to get really creative and you don't want to leave your house, try freezing flowers in water. And it's amazing what interesting compositions you can come up with flowers frozen in water. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is shooting from different angles. Particularly important with flower photography, because most people see flowers. How do most people who are going to be looking at your flower images see flowers? They're going to be looking straight down at them, right? Because they're standing up, walking through a garden, and they're going to be looking down. Now, that's not to say not to do that, but if you can find compositions where you have unusual angles of flowers, that will help you to create, oops, go back here, to create something that is more unusual. And somebody said this, and I don't know who, but I know I've just paraphrased it, but I think this is true in most any type of photography. The most interesting compositions are usually taken at least 5 feet above or 5 feet below where you would normally hold your camera. And that's very obviously why, is because people look at everything from eye level. So if you can show them something that's not at eye level, that will be more interesting. Underneath side, here's a couple example on Temple Square there. I was down on the cement looking up at that. Here's an even more unusual angle for flowers, for tulips in springtime. Side views are less common and more interesting. Upside down flowers are less common and more interesting. Underside of a flower can be more interesting than the front side. Backs of flowers are interesting. Show interesting detail that most people don't pay attention to. Shooting upwards using the sky as a backdrop is often less common. Okay, so then the next thing, after shooting from another angle, look for opposites. We talked about that a little bit earlier where I showed you the highlighted flowers next to the dark walls, but look for opposites because here again, they're eye-catching, light and dark. This picture actually was taken in the parking lot of the hotel we were staying at in Disneyland. You wouldn't know that, or you'd think I was in Hawaii, wouldn't you? But we were walking through the parking lot and there was this one beam of sunlight shining on that bird of paradise, and all the background was in in shadow. So that was interesting enough for me to stop and take a picture. There's another light flower with a dark background. Opposites, soft focus, sharp focus is interesting. In this case, I've got the part of the flower I want you to look at in sharp focus. And even though that is only a small part of the flower, that's still a large part of the real estate. So it's not lost in the whole composition. So the part I want you to look at is in sharp focus, and the rest of the composition is in soft focus. Now, I'm not going to go this time around, because we're talking about artistry. Some of these things are what I mentioned at the beginning. If these are some things you'd like to learn how to do, this will be incentive for you to, if you don't know how to do this already, to figure out how you do this with depth of field. And there's plenty of classes and club members that can help you learn these things. And or if there's anything that we may want to do something else in another class, we can do that too. But once again, just look at these kind of for the creative aspects of what I'm showing you. Here's another one where the flower's in sharp focus and the background is soft focus. Look for smooth and textured elements in the same image. The one on the left, the flower is the textured and the background is smooth. And the one on the right, the background is really textured and the front is a smoother, rounder with the rounded parts of the petals. That makes for an interesting contrast. In this one, the frame is divided where half of the background is smooth textured and the other half is textured. And there's another one that's not quite as dramatic, where the background is textured and the petals and the stamen are smooth, round petals. Near far, here again, the grand vistas. If you take a photo and you're fairly close to your subject flowers, the flowers can still be the subject, but you give your viewer a chance to see where those flowers are and their eye travels from the flowers back into your frame. Here's another example of, this was in the middle of a bright day. This is in Moab, but I have never before nor since, we travel quite a bit in southern Utah. We've got side-by-sides and go out a lot, but I have never seen a sago lily field in bloom like I saw in this trip. So I was going to take pictures regardless if they turned out horrible. And what I ended up doing is in the very front of that picture, you can see that front flower is in shadow. Right in front of that, there is just deep shadows everywhere. But I found a composition where I could hide I could hide the deep shadows and still get, you can see on the leaves, there's shadows on those leaves too. So once again, it's not the greatest situation there, but nevertheless, it can be handled. Once again, another one, opposites, looking for straight lines and curved lines. Makes interesting compositions. The straight lines of these cactus spines with the curve of the ladybug and the softness of the cactus flower makes that more interesting. Talk about color a little bit. Obviously, we're shooting flowers. Colors should be vibrant, but they shouldn't be neon unless you're going for a fantasy look, or something that you are knowing is not going to look real. But if you're looking for real, you need to look for vibrant, but not out of the ordinary neon. Unusual colors. It's often unusual to see blue colored flowers. They're quite rare. This was on the South Island of New Zealand. Interesting color combinations. Now this is a major clash. This is not one of my favorite pictures, but it's an eye catcher. So I left it in here just because you take notice of those bright colors. This one's more pleasing with the soft yellow background. And notice I have, if you want to talk about a photography rule 101, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute, is diagonal lines. And so notice how I've composed this with that one leaf of that tulip on a diagonal to the corner. Look, I love color coordinated things. Obviously, if you have an insect or something else in your picture, that becomes the subject. And I've got a few of those here. But I love when things color coordinate. I love that bug's wings were green and it color coordinated with the background. Here, the daffodil is mimicking the background color. The tulip blossom or the cactus blossom is mimicking the sky. And this was before dawn. Here, the background edges of those leaves are mimicking the color of the main flowers. And this is one of my favorite pictures. I don't know why. I know other people probably don't think it's all that great. It's just a common, ordinary iris. But I not only love the colors, purple and yellow are my favorite colors, but if you notice the detail in those petals mimic the detail of the weeds in the front of that image. And so for whatever reason, that's one of my favorite color coordinated flower images. Colors or different shades of the same color can be really interesting. There were so many pink flowers, buds in the back of these two pictures here that it turned these whole images the same color, but it makes for something somewhat different. That second one was taken in Samoa. Subject flowers surrounded by flowers of a different color, kind of like we talked about before with the light. That is interesting. If you can find one flower that is the lone wolf amongst other flowers, that makes for an interesting composition. Neutral color or limited color can also be interesting because once again, that's something you don't often see. And I threw black and white. I know there's always people that are black and white photographers. I personally am not a black and white person except for certain types of photography, and I'm really not for flowers, but I know somebody there will want to do that, so it certainly can be done. Altering the white balance can really make a difference in how your flowers look. Sometimes, particularly with our digital cameras of today, our pictures often take on a color cast all on their own. I took this picture this was in Fiji, and I was so busy taking pictures, I really didn't notice it. But when I got home and put it up on the camera, I thought, whoa, those leaves or those petals are supposed to be white. And of course, they took up all of the green that was behind. So I color corrected in post-processing. That's how it actually looked to my eye. But then I was just being a little creative, and I noticed that the stems of that plant or flower, whatever it was, had a purple tinge to it. So I thought, well, what would it look like if the flowers were a little bit purple too? So that's just an example of how different your images can look depending on the color cast. And you can change some of that in camera with your white balance or in post-processing. Look for unusual elements to include in your composition. This is because oftentimes we see flowers, and flowers are the only thing in the image because a lot of people point down and they're either in a garden or they're limited as what else can be in that image. So if you can find unusual, or not unusual, but elements that are not usually seen in flower images, that can create a different. This, of course, is on Temple Square. I made the background here soft focus because I just wanted the lines to show. But obviously you can do a near to far. The flowers still take up a large enough space that you know that the viewer is supposed to be also looking at the flowers, but the temple is also in sharp focus. Here, this is San Juan Capistrano Mission in California. The flowers still take up about 2/3 of the image, but I wanted something else to add interest, and so I wanted those interesting arches. This probably isn't the greatest, but this was in New Zealand, and this was an old boathouse right by the water, and it was just in shambles, and everything around it was dead, and that rose bush was dead, except there was that one branch with leaves on it and that one perfect flower. And it's not a great flower composition. If it were, I would have cropped in, but this was just for my memory, just to notice the contrast between that one perfect red bloom and the old worn out boathouse that it was leaning up against. Other interesting compositions, this was a gate by Temple Square, the fence at Temple Square, just made something different, a little bit different, that a viewer would look at, wonder what it is. I threw this one in because this was in Singapore. Probably not a big deal to everyone living in Singapore, but not only here in Utah do we not see lush, beautiful orchids growing, but this was this was outside. We were waiting for our ride at the airport. So I just thought, with that glass and all that silver and glass, it was just interesting to see those beautiful flowers stuck there, kind of in the middle of a city of steel and glass. Just another picture of interesting architecture complementing the flowers. People, you can put people in your flower images, and the flowers can still be a big part of the image. I want to mention a little bit about my composition in this one. I used to be a wedding photographer, but this was not one of my pictures. I was just there taking pictures. This was before they stopped everybody from going there and taking pictures. This was quite a few years ago, but I was just there taking pictures, and there was a photographer right off of the frame to my right, taking a picture of this couple, and I couldn't resist taking a picture. But I just wanted I want you to look at the composition here. If I had had those people with the background of the trees, with the trees growing out of their head, that would not have made as great a composition or as good of a composition as I think it is in this case, where I've positioned the people in the vacant space, which gives them their own space in the background. Here's another case of a person. This was just an accident, once again in New Zealand. I was just looking to do the tulips in the front and mimicked by the tulips in the back, and this little guy ran into the picture, and I just happened to click the shutter right when he was in the perfect spot running into the image and in the middle of those two tulips. Insects, of course, are the easiest thing to add as interest, and then, like I said before, your insect will become the subject, and your flower then will take the back seat to the insect. But I do have a comment about insects. If you're trying to create an interesting picture, a wow picture, you need to look for insects that are either unusual, or where your perspective is unusual, or they're doing something unusual, because all of us see pictures of ladybugs or grasshoppers or snails or that, and they're interesting, but they're not all that unique or unusual. And this is one of the rare times where I think I managed to get an unusual picture, a picture of a ladybug swinging from a petal, showing her underside. I think I nailed that one. I like this one too, because he was dangling out on just one of those little wisps of whatever that puffball was. Any type of unusual architecture adds interest. These were, this unusual flower, whatever that is the background is some rice terraces in Bali. And I thought this was interesting. This is Snow Canyon, right behind where I live now, but you don't usually see flowering trees. You see cactus, but you don't usually see flowering trees in desert scenes, where you've got the red rocks and the red cliffs. And so I always look for this tree to come into bloom, and it's the one tree that I've ever found in Snow Canyon that's like a flowering fruit tree. Try to find flowers that are unusual, or parts of flowers that people don't take the time to look at. This is in Bali. Now because I'm talking about unusual flowers, I just thought it might be interesting. We haven't traveled a lot of places, but the places we've traveled have been we have traveled quite a few tropical places. So here's just sit back and look at just a couple of these pictures that I've taken in different places. This is Costa Rica, Costa Rica, Costa Rica, Hawaii, Hawaii, New Caledonia, Roatan, Fiji, 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 Cayman Islands. Okay, enough of that. Okay, fill the frame or not fill the frame. Moving on to something else to consider as you're composing in your camera. Filling the entire frame with one flower can be dramatic or it can be boring. It depends on how interesting that center of your flower is. This one, I think it works. There's a lot going on there, and I think it's interesting enough to hold its own. Oh, now my thing's not changing again. There we go. This flower is questionable. I took the picture because I love those variegated leaves. I thought that was really unusual. I think it's a tulip, and Temple Square, as probably most of you know, has some of the most unusual tulips, but the center is kind of boring. So, you know, not my best. Not showing the entire flower can be more interesting, but here's another case. The leaves, the petals of that tulip were really interesting, but there's no real center for your eye to focus on. So I'm not sure that's all that great of an image. This one by far is a much better example of what I'm trying to say. You're only showing part of the flower, but the part of the flower that you're emphasizing is a really interesting part, and the background coordinates and adds to the image because it picks up the same color as the center of your flower. Showing only a small part of your center can be intriguing if it's interesting. Personally, I think this looks kind of creepy, but I like it. It kind of looks like fingers reaching up into the frame, but kind of interesting. Here's another one that I thought the center of that flower was interesting enough that I only wanted to put part of that center. Okay, so why doesn't this one work? My goal was to show off the center of that flower. It's a magnolia, I think. And the center was really interesting and kind of detailed. So I'll tell you, because you guys are all muted, you've got this really big, boring white leaf in the front of that, which takes up a whole lot of real estate in that frame. So in my personal opinion, it's okay, but not really great composition. This one's a little better. I've changed an angle, I've moved in. You can see the center better, but you still have that white sky up there. If my goal was really to show the center of that flower, then this, to me, is the best composition. And everybody kind of just see as you're visualizing compositions, at least how I go about. The reason I did a composition this way is because one of the things that I will talk about that is one of the basic rules of composition is the rule of thirds. And if there's one rule that I think would be my most important rule for you to think about is the rule of thirds, because I personally think that most all flower compositions look better when your main subject is not smack dab in the center of your composition. Once in a while it works. So not ever, you can throw that rule out if you think it should be thrown out. But most of the time, at least for me, flowers that are not in the center are a better composition. So that's what I was doing there. But then when I looked at it, I thought, no, this is another thing. Luckily, I'm going to go back and talk. I'm going to skip over and talk about something else. We're going to talk about a little bit later, but this is a good example. A lot of times photographers will tell you to crop in your camera, to get your image right in the camera. And I'm going to go all against that. I will say crop in your camera if you're planning on blowing up your images to billboard size, because you're going to need every pixel you can get probably to enlarge them. But if you're going to just blow up to something that you put on your wall in your living room, I always crop out, because so many times I see all sorts of different images when I'm home in the computer and I'm not in the throes of trying to find compositions and find other images and know what to do. And that's what happened here. This was the original image. So then I cropped in thinking, oh, well, maybe I'd like that one. And then I thought, no, that doesn't do it. Whoops, that doesn't do it. And so then I cropped in further. So that's my, at least that's my philosophy of shooting out and then cropping in on the computer. But I did just want to put in a picture of a single petal. And the reason this one works is because the petal is the subject, and it's an interesting petal. It's colorful, it's got beautiful lines in it. And so it wasn't necessarily that the petal was wrong in the other one, it's just the type of petal and how that was displayed. Okay, another creative thing to look for is finding repeating elements where your supporting elements mimic your subject, as in this case. Just a couple examples of where your supporting elements actually are the same shape as your subject. This one, if you notice in this composition, this I hope you can visualize the importance of where you stand and how you move around. Obviously, the main subject is that clump of, tell me what it is. My mind's gone blank. Spring.
Hydrangea.
Hydrangea. Thank you. And because that clump of hydrangea are small, little tiny flowers, if I had put that over to the right side of the frame and had the background, even in soft focus of that group of them in the background, I think it would have been lost, or at least not nearly as dynamic of a composition. But I moved around until I could find some distance and some space where I still had the background that showed the surroundings, but I was able to put those where the stems, the green stems, separated the subject flower from the background. Can you kind of see that? See what I'm thinking of there? What I'm thinking? Okay, I've gone totally off my notes, so let's see what I've totally forgotten. I'm good. Just another case where the background in some way mimics the subject flowers. Even in this one, you have your main flower in the front, but other flowers like it are trailing that takes your eye into the frame. Look for something out of place or imperfect, because that's something rare. Usually we look for, I'll get to that in the next one, but the lone flower, once again, this is another case for finding a flower that is totally different from the other flowers in the picture. A couple like that. Look for an imperfect flower, something that's wrong, something that's deformed, because that's unusual. We don't try to take pictures of things that are not perfect, but that adds character when you have a flower that has something wrong. Even this one where you've got the leaves almost falling apart, but it's almost like a little peek into the center of that flower, even though it's seen better days. Something more unusual is flowers just about to bloom. Often you don't see flowers that are still in that stage of blooming. Again, flowers past their prime or that are not very pretty. Okay, so we're moving on. You've got to decide, and this kind of goes along with some of the things I talked about earlier. You have to decide on the right depth of field. If you use a shallow depth of field where only your subject flower is in focus, that really makes your subject flower stand out, particularly if you leave a little bit of interest, like we've talked about earlier, with some texture so that it's not totally out of focus. You can use a super depth of field where only a small part of your flower is in focus, like I showed you one earlier, where here just a really small part of that flower is in focus, but yet that small part takes up a large part of the frame of the entire composition. If that flower had been a smaller part of that composition and the part that was in focus was just those teeny little parts, it would have been lost. You can create a grand vista once again where everything is in focus. Here's something that I just want to mention. Oftentimes landscape photographers talk about having everything in absolute sharp focus from front to your mountains behind. And oftentimes photographers will go to great lengths to do that by photo stacking and doing all sorts of fun things to make their images tack sharp from foreground to background. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think there's some wiggle room and some fudging that you can do when your foreground interest are flowers. Here's my thought on that. Flowers have, as in this picture, flowers have teensy tiny parts and petals to them. If that flower was in a sharp focus and that background was in absolutely sharp focus too, I think you would lose a lot of that flower and it wouldn't show off that flower nearly as well as it does when I have that background in soft focus, softer focus. So I think in circumstances like this, even if you could make that sharp focus from front to back, maybe you opt not to, just because that flower is more visible with the background not quite as sharp. You can use sharp focus throughout, which creates a very dreamy mood. So even photos that flower photography, you can do a lot of fudging on. Maybe you want something to be sharp focus and you look at, this has happened to me a lot of times, and I focused on something and I've brought it up on my computer and my focus wasn't right and it was all soft focus, and I look at it and I think, wow, I really like it like that. So who knows? This was in New Caledonia. The center was interesting, and I tried sharp focus and I tried something soft focus with that, and I frankly liked that kind of otherworldly soft focus look. Okay, here's an example of when that doesn't work. I was focusing on that purplish colored flower, but I hope everybody can see why this is not a good picture. And I hope I've shown you enough pictures that you can see where you can use sharp focus and soft focus on the same images and have them look beautiful. But this is not one of them. And the reason is my camera had such a narrow depth of field that it threw everything in front of that picture in soft focus. And those are bright yellow flowers, and they totally take over and kind of mess with your eyes as far as I'm concerned. Here's another one, same thing happened. The flower I was actually looking to be in focus ended up in, and you can see that's a huge flower that I wanted to take up the frame, but that ended up in really soft focus, and the little itty bitty blue flower in the front, they're the ones that are in sharp focus. And for that particular composition, in my opinion, that does not work at all. So you've got to be careful of how you use sharp and soft focus in the same image. Create interest with lens distortion. And two things about this is, one, you're going to run across some things, or you already have that you think, wow, I really like the look of that. And you say, I have no idea how to do that. This goes back to me telling you that the artist in you will be the engine that spurs you on to learn the technical stuff. When I first saw years ago flowers that I looked at, this was before I even knew about different lenses and different things. And I could tell it looked different, but I couldn't put my finger on it, being a new photographer. But it's all I know is that the subject flower was abnormally big in the frame. But for some reason, just for me, I really liked that look. It stood out and it was unique. So of course I figured out, and I asked around and found out that if you use a wide angle lens and you position your camera very close to your subject flower, it will distort your image and make that flower look bigger than normal. So you can create all sorts of different looks with different lenses. There's another one like that with a wide angle lens. If you use a telephoto lens, that brings everything more into perspective. It brings the background up close. Or if you use a telephoto lens close to your subject flower in the foreground, then it will blur your background. So if you're using camera with lenses, there's all sorts of ways that you can use those lenses to create different looks. Obviously, you can use a macro lens that shows your details up close. You can use specialty lenses. I have a Lens Baby. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Lens Babies, but they create specialty lenses that do interesting things when you take photos, if that's something you're interested in. Even fisheye can create mega distortion, but it's something different. So somebody, my guess is, they may not think it's the greatest photo, but they're going to take a second look because it's a different view than they usually see. You can use creative glass. You can, in my other photo club, we just had somebody do a presentation on shooting flowers through a microscope. I still don't know how he did it, but talk about some interesting pictures. You can use glass globes. They're kind of popular, magnifying glasses. You can use all sorts of glass in front of your lens to create interesting situations. I don't know if any of you remember this or were there, but this was quite a few years ago. This was at the Bellagio in their atrium, and they had these humongous water globes. That was 6 feet tall, 8 feet tall, those globes. And they had these in there that reflected the spring flowers, and it was really beautiful. Okay, simplify everything. Any type of photography, but flower photography the same. You need to watch the side of your frame for photo bombs, anything that distracts from your main subject or from what you want people to be looking at. I actually did this one on purpose, thinking that leaf, I was thinking about it as an added element. You know, like I told you before, one that causes tension, that you look at the main subject and then you look at something over on the side to see how interesting that is. And I thought that was an interesting leaf. It had detail and texture. But after I got up on the screen, I looked at it, I thought, no, I personally, funny, I've asked a lot of people what they think about that. And they half love it and half don't. So, you know, it's all in the eye of the beholder. So I cropped it out. And for me, that's a much more dynamic image. But half of the people I showed this to like that one. So who knows? So here's an example of that I wanted to show you what can either make or break an image. Lot of errant light coming through. Always look at your background, try to find perspectives that you can cut that out. Sometimes it's just not possible. So then your option is to leave it like it is and call it good because you like the image so much, or it's a memory, or you edit in post-processing, or if you have the time, you change your DOF or your lens to blur the background. We were on a tour here, if I remember, and I didn't have time to do any of that. So when I got that home, if I wanted to keep that, I had to do something in post-processing. And what I did, I left some of those bokeh points in there just because I don't know why I did, but I took out most all of the big light blotches. So there you have both. I hope you can see the difference. And at least for my taste, I much like the one on the right better. And now as I'm looking at it, I probably should have gone back and taken out even more of the little bokeh spots. But the second one certainly is better in my opinion than that first one. Here's another case where I already talked about this about cropping. When I cropped this out, and mainly because I wanted to show surroundings, and I wanted to show some of the lily pads and some of the other little flowers in there. But when I got it up on my screen, I hadn't even noticed that bee. And so then that bee kind of became a more important part of that picture. And I realized that even though my flower takes up the biggest part of that screen, it would have been much more, it would be much more dynamic if I cropped a lot of the excess background out. So here again, this is another vote for seeing something better that you can crop into. Once again, things not to do. You can't have so much interest, either background or other, that if you're shooting a small flower, that you're overpowering it. Frankly, I really loved that background, but for that image, it was way, way too much. And so I'm not crazy about the image either, but it was a good image to show you that at least cropping it in made that a more dynamic image. Okay, getting close here. See where I am. Oh, just another couple cases of, I've talked a lot about making interesting backgrounds, but once again, you've got to be careful. Here again, I just wanted to show you a couple cases where I've taken pictures and come back and realized this does not work. That background is way too busy for the size of those flowers. Interesting background. It shows movement and color and bokeh, all the things I love. But in this image, not so good, not so much. Here is a better photo showing these are really tiny, tiny flowers. And if you notice, I've kept the background very soft. It's not totally blank. It's boring. It's got texture and you can see the stem, but it certainly shows off. This doesn't show off those flowers at all. This one shows off the flowers. Here's one that probably have as many likes as dislikes. This is a really busy background and a small flower. But in my opinion, that flower still holds a big part of that composition, and the busy part is not behind that smallish flower. So I kind of like that composition. A lot of people don't like it, but since I'm a background kind of gal, I kind of like it. But here again, all individual tastes, just some things to give you an idea of where your taste might be and what is possibility for you. Okay, so here again, just some basics to consider. And I already talked about rule of thirds. Once again, I think that for flower images, it's often much more interesting for flowers to be offset. And you don't have to use the tic-tac-toe board and put it on the cross sections of anywhere that's not the center is good enough for me. This is taken in Honduras. Another rule of thumb to kind of consider if you're doing a vista shot is where to put the horizon. And once again, most of the time, if you're looking at photography 101, horizons are more interesting if they're not dead center of your frame. So in both of those images, the flower is still what you're looking at, but depending on if the sky is interesting or not, I've altered where I've put the horizon. Other things to include that are always interesting are S curves, C curves, circles, diagonal lines, horizontal lines, leading lines. A couple examples of that. It's an S curve. There's kind of a backward C curve, kind of a circle, diagonal, diagonal, diagonal. This was taken years ago in Antelope Valley, California, when they had a super bloom. It was really gorgeous. Horizontal lines. Leading lines are always great if you're doing a kind of a vista shot, but I do want to show you an example here. This was, at the lavender fields again. So leading lines do what they say. They lead your eye into your frame, which is what you want to do, want your viewer to do. But it always helps if it's leading into something. And this, I guess it could be leading into that mountain. I've posted this one and before, and I've had a lot of comments on it. People like it. But I did some Photoshop magic just for this presentation. What do you think about that? Does that make it a much more dynamic composition where the lines actually lead to those trees? I think it does. This one is a better example of leading lines leading to something of interest. Leading lines can actually lead in the opposite direction. This one is a little more subtle, but I personally really like it. The flowers on the right take up a large amount of the frame, But if you follow the flowers, it leads you across over to the left-hand side of the frame and then diagonally right into the main subject of that picture. So it keeps your eye moving around through that frame. Okay, so some other things that I think are kind of really will, sometimes it's the little things that make a huge difference. And one thing that I think makes a big difference in flower photography is to look for natural frames to put emphasis on your subject. We're going to talk about vignettes in just a minute, but natural frames will do it's one of the best things that you can do to emphasize your flower and to make your flower stand out. Here, obviously, the trees are not in sharp focus, but they are framing the flower. Natural frames don't have to be all around your subject, and they don't have to be any shape. This was just a tulip by an old wall, but the two lines that are surrounding it, that are darker even, create a natural frame that highlights that tulip. Can you see that if you weren't looking for it, or you were not a photographer, you wouldn't even notice the frame on this picture? But the leaves were beautiful on that. This was in Belize. Were beautiful on that flower. The one leaf on the left, if it weren't such a soft leaf, it could match. And if it were really bright, if the light had been really bright on it, that could have been very distracting. But because the background is really all soft green and the flower is the only color, the leaf up on the left-hand side and then that leaf curving on the other side create a natural frame for that flower to sit in. There's another flower sitting in between two trees. It's in Costa Rica. You can look for natural, or they may not be natural frames, but they're frames within the scene. That's, once again, a gate or some wrought iron thing that I noticed was back there. So I moved until I put the flower right underneath it. Even what the flower sits around can act as a natural frame. The fact that that cactus plant basically circles all of those blooms acts as a frame. This was taken years ago, and it's still one of my favorite examples of a natural frame. The sun was in the right spot where it made the back of that cactus plant darker so that it set off that bloom really well. And the edge of that plant, of course, encircles the flower, which was the frame. And even the spines are pointing to that bloom, saying, look at me, look here, here's where the subject is, here's where you're supposed to be looking at. So anyway, you get the idea. Look for areas in your composition that complement and can act as a frame around your flower. Same way with that dark window up on Temple Square. I thought that was a natural frame to add my subject flower, or behind my subject flower. Then you have to decide on the format, whether you want a horizontal, a vertical, a square, or a pano. And that, of course, is dependent. I chose some really obvious ones, but sometimes it's not really so obvious. But your format can really either complement or distract from your photo. Obviously, with that bloom, which was sideways like that, the horizontal was the best option. If this was in Samoa. Incidentally, I will say, if any of you out there are travelers and you want to travel to do flowers, of the tropical places I've been in, both the South Pacific and the Caribbean area, the two places that have just blown my mind with their flowers are first Costa Rica and second Samoa. So there's my two places for tropical flowers. This one little hotel we stayed at here in Samoa, it was this quaint old historic hotel. These flower pots, that flower arrangement was probably 6 to 7 feet high. And they had those all over the lobby. Everywhere you look, they had the most gorgeous flowers. And because the sides were extraneous stuff that I didn't want in my picture, obviously a vertical shot was the right shot. In addition to those humongous flowers, they had these are kava bowls on every flat surface, on the desks, on the coffee tables, on the side tables. they had a kava bowl with water and these beautiful little floating petal and leaf decorations. It was just so delightful, so beautiful. And in this case, I chose a square format. This one, because I wanted to include the flowers, I chose a pano. For those of you who are LDS, this is the Hamilton, New Zealand temple. Had an interesting request for this, one of the few interesting requests I've had. Somebody had seen this picture online and contacted me and said that her dad had died a couple of years ago and her mother had just died, and they had been married in this temple, and her mother loved flowers, and she saw this picture and she wanted my permission to give this picture to the headstone engraver because she wanted this picture on their tombstone. So I said yes. So one of my pictures is on a tombstone somewhere. Once again, look at your backgrounds. Remember that they are wasted real estate if they don't have interest, and they can be interesting without distracting. This is a case where I think the background is interesting, but it doesn't detract from the main subject. If you want to get fancy, you can, and you can't do it when you're out in the field. Take some flowers into your house and photograph them in front of a wall, and then make your own background and you may like it or you may not like it, but it will teach you things. It will teach you how to be artistic and creative, and you'll learn something new if you work at it. If you do use negative space, if you don't have an interesting background, sometimes that's what it calls for. And you need to know why it adds interest. And so, for example, in this case, I could have had an interesting background, but I thought that one flower with that light beam shining on it was enough to hold its own. So I wanted just the plain, soft, black background. So my rule of thumb when shooting common flowers, if I'm shooting flowers that are commonly seen and commonly photographed, tulips, roses, daffodils, there has to be something, and I've shot these for so many years that I rarely go out and just shoot these flowers unless I can find a composition that is unique or interesting. And usually that means that the background is unique or different than anything I have shot before, or that there's some exceptional lighting. There's got to be something exceptional about the flower for me to be interested. My exception to that rule of thumb is truly if I am shooting an exotic or a rare flower, or there's something really unusual about the flower, then the flower can hold its own, and then maybe a boring background is good enough. Here's another case. This isn't totally boring, but that flower was so, the whole thing is big, but the pieces of it are so tiny that I knew if I had any type of a background behind that, it would lose the flower. Same thing with this one. So I'm going to talk about drive-by shootings really quickly. We're getting close. As I said earlier, you don't need to go to Tahiti or New Caledonia to have fun shooting flowers. And you can find just your creativity and your inspiration can turn the flowers that we see every day into interesting flowers. They may not be as super interesting as what you might find in Jamaica, but they can still be interesting. One of my favorite photographers said, I maintain that there is always extraordinary to be found in the ordinary. Sometimes it just takes the eyes to see it. So whenever I go out with my camera around here, I always challenge myself to find at least one composition that is something different than I've ever done before. And that's really different. And sometimes it's in my own backyard, or you can find those while you're taking your dog for a walk or while you're driving around town. And I've posted this online not too long ago, but it's a good example. So I was driving in my car one day not too long ago, and this was what I saw. I just snapped this with my iPhone. Can you see my picture in this picture? It was in the middle of the day. There were a few clouds, but you can see the horrible shadows and the bad coloring. So I came back a few hours later with my big girl camera, and that's the sun had moved, and that's my image. So does that, and not that it's overly spectacular, but can you see where you can take some of the things that you might be seeing or walking past every day and find something fun and interesting to take pictures of? This was taken, I was practically got run over by a car on this one. I was laying down in the side of the street and there was a planter. This is in downtown Santa Clara, down here in the St. George area on the main street. And this was right in the middle of or right at the side of the street. This is close to my back door. This was right on a main road. Well, there was right behind this lilac. I had to photograph this because I don't see very many lilacs down here, and I miss my lilacs up there. But this plant was right by the road and right by a brick wall. So I had to find a composition where some of the other blooms hid the wall, and I had to use a shallow depth of field so that you didn't see the wall. That was in my backyard up north. One day I was trying to work on learning DOF and how to improve my my narrow depth of field. So I cut this lily out of my yard and brought it in the house and set it up and practiced inside. So you can even do things inside. There's some Valentine's roses my husband gave me, and I noticed it matched a vase I had sitting on the counter. So that's something fun and interesting you can do. My mom died a little bit ago, and she used to collect china cups and saucers and did china painting. And I know I can't keep all of her china collection, but photographing is a way I can remember her. And I looked at that cup, and I think it might be a rose. I don't know what that is, but I've had some peonies growing in my yard that were that same color, and some yellow roses. So one day it was just fun for me to create a little vignette there with my mom's cup and roses and flowers, and just do something fun at home. Christmas time, Christmas lights and poinsettia. There's all sorts of interesting, fun, creative, artistic things you can do with flower photography, either in your house, out of your house, or on your vacations. Okay, I'll show you this, this one just because it's kind of funny. One day, fall time, it was cold and wet and miserable, and I hate the cold, and I wasn't going to go take pictures outside. So I decided I was going to experiment inside. So I went outside long enough to collect all these little things outside, raced back in the house, and this was what I created. So the next picture is going to show you how it really looked. I put it I put those things on a cookie sheet. I used some wire and I hung those leaves so that they looked like they were falling. I set my camera up on a tripod, and I had a cable release, and I stood there and poured water over the top of them so that it looked like water was pouring, and came up with that. So my point is there's all sorts of things you can do. So practice, that's what you need to do. Patience. I'm sure you've all probably heard this saying, but it's really true. By I can't ever pronounce his last name. Your first 10,000 photographs are your worst. I still think that spending money on workshops and education first will improve your photography, because then you will know what to spend on gear and gadgets. We've talked about joining photography websites, educational websites, clubs, analyze other photographers' images, go to art galleries and photo galleries, study paintings, study the works of famous painters and photographers to look about how they compose their work. One of the best things I found is to be outdoors with or without your camera and simply enjoying nature and studying how the light falls on and imagining photo compositions in your mind. So I want to talk at the very end here, to edit or not edit. I know we still have diehard people that if you edit your photos and use software, you're cheating, and that's not what photography is. But You know, what do you do when your camera can't produce what your eye or your mind's eye sees? I think it's interesting is I've gone back recently and looked at not only photos that I've taken, but photos of famous photographers that were taken, you know, several decades ago. And the fact is that a lot of those photos look dull. They're not as sharp. And I think nowadays, people in general, we're used to seeing sharp, colorful, bright images because we have the software that helps us to do what our cameras can't. And so I guess we all need to make that decision if we want our images to be comparable to, or even better than other photographers that we see every day. I firmly believe that we have got to be willing to do some editing, even if it's just basic editing of cropping and a little exposure enhancement or vibrance enhancement, because that's what the general public is used to seeing. And if you're happy with your photos just the way they are coming right out of your camera, then that's great. But if your camera is not doing what you want it to do, and you know that it's doing what it's capable of doing, then you've got to resort to some basic photo editing. And here again, cropping is something simple that everybody can learn that makes a big difference. Sometimes I crop different crops just to see what I might like. I'm not that one is worse than the other, but sometimes it's just fun to see what other crops might do to an image. Here's something else that I think is really, really important that I want to talk to you about. A few years ago, kind of right when Photoshop really became popular and everybody was doing HDR stuff and all of that, one of the big trends was to do a heavy vignette around your pictures. I don't see it nearly as much, but I still see it. And I think that if you're doing photography outside and you want it to look natural, don't ever put a vignette, a heavy vignette like this is around your picture. It's still a great picture. The lighting is good. It shows off the picture, but it speaks manipulated really badly. If you're doing something that you want people to know is manipulated, you know, go for it. That's great. But usually heavy vignettes look phony and are really distracting. The most effective vignettes are barely noticeable, and you don't, the normal person looking at a photo, and even other photographers looking at this picture, you have no idea whether I've put a vignette on this picture or not. Because most vignettes, when you're taking photos out in nature, are not equal in lighting on every side. Even on a dark, gloomy day, you will have light coming in from some direction, most always. So when you want something to look natural, as I did in this picture, I slightly darkened the right-hand side and the bottom of this picture and left the top light, because that adds dimension to your picture and still shows off your subject, but makes it look more interesting and believable. I hope you can see that. I don't have the original to this one, but I have a couple of examples in just a minute. Here, the same thing. I wanted to leave those, the petals of that hibiscus in the picture because it's interesting texture and design, but the center is tiny little parts. And so I wanted to emphasize that. So once again, I left the part I want the viewer's eyes to look at first in as lighter and a bigger part of the frame, but then I softly darkened the rest of the frame to take a back seat. So here's a better example. So this was in Tahiti. That flower is really tiny and there's a lot of wild leaves going on in the background. The lighting on the flower I thought was great. It's right on that light. It's highlighting the flower, but it's also highlighted. There's a few other bright spots that you can see, not many, but it's also highlighting the leaves and particularly those big leaves in the bottom. It's an okay picture, but there's my picture with my editing on it. I hope you can see the difference on that. I've actually lightened, if you look at the top, I've actually lightened the top because that's where the light would naturally be coming in to light that flower. And I've taken those big leaves at the bottom and I have darkened them so that your eye now is, your background is still interesting and it still shows context, but your eye still is drawn right to that flower without without the too bright lighting coming in. And if I were to say one thing about all the things we've talked about, some of these little things will either be the difference between a good photo and a really good photo. Here's another example. This is a little bit harder to see, but I think you'll get the idea. I was just taking a picture of these flowers, and the butterfly flew in right while I was taking it. So I knew the butterfly was going to be the subject. And I thought about cropping in and making that butterfly bigger, but I actually really like the flowers. I don't know, I just like the color. So I left the butterfly in, but I knew I could improve it with lighting. Are your screens good enough that you can see the difference in those two pictures? I've lightened the area around the butterfly, and I've lightened the top of the frame a little bit, and I've darkened the bottom part of it. And to me, that makes that butterfly stand out without looking phony. Here's another one that you can see a much better. Picture's good, but the lighting, the day I was taking it was not right on that flower, whatever that is. This was in Costa Rica, and the light is bright on those leaves. So in post-processing, that's what I did. I increased the vibrance a little bit. I increased the soft lighting on the flower. And then if you look at the big petals, you'll notice those I've darkened. To me, that makes a much more impactful image than the first one if I'd have just left it alone. Other things you can do if you want to get fancy, kind of like I was talking before, you can photo stack, you can shutter speed stack, you can use overlays, just a little bit of talking if you really are interested in the techie kind of stuff. I was doing overlays a fair amount years ago. I don't do it much anymore, and here it's personal taste. That was just some flowers that's sitting in the windowsill at home. On the left-hand side and the right side, I put a texture behind it, and that's the texture I put behind. Incidentally, though, even now, when I'm out shooting flower photos anywhere outside, if I see interesting textures, I will always take pictures of them because I create my own textures. I rarely, if ever, have bought textures. And oftentimes I will put my camera on manual. I think I have no, that's not it. I'll show that to you. Oftentimes I will put my camera on manual and take pictures, blurred pictures of a scene that I can use as background. I think I have a picture of that. Remember that picture I showed you earlier that was this boring background right at the beginning? So I thought, okay, what would this look like if I put a texture behind it? And that's my picture with the texture behind it. And what I did, so that you want things to look real, if you look at that flower, where is the light shining on that flower? It's shining on that right hand petal. So in the texture I used, I made the right hand upper corner brighter than the rest of the background to emulate the natural light that was coming in on that flower. And there's the texture I used part of for that flower. Incidentally, I was sitting in the car, my husband in the passenger seat, my husband ran into the store to get something. I happened to have my camera with me, and it was raining, and I saw the raindrops on the windshield, and I knew if I put my camera on manual and blurred so it was not sharp focus, that it would turn those raindrops into light globes. And so that's what I used to do that. Here's another picture I just took at Thanksgiving Point. I just blurred my camera, took that picture that I might want to use as a background. Textures. This was when I was doing something for a specific project, and it was for Valentine's Day. Can you see my artwork in that picture? You have to look really close. The reflections are real from the window. I had that sitting in front of my window, but I added that little red heart on that big drop, dewdrop, which of course came from a spray bottle in that case. And if you want to go really crazy, nobody says you can't do fantasy stuff. It's all in the eye of the beholder and what's fun and creative for you to do. One last one, I think. I took this and somehow it just, I don't know, I just didn't like it. It's got some great bokeh. The photo is sharp in the front and the background is good, but the background looked like cotton candy, and I didn't like that big thing over in the left-hand corner. So the first thing I did was I softened the picture because I thought it needed to be softened, and I cropped it in. And then I kind of like that. And then I thought, hey, I'm just going to be crazy. It looks like cotton candy. Let me do something really wild and crazy. So here again, just whatever is fun for you. So my takeaway is when you're visualizing a composition, think about what techniques you can use either in camera, and some of the techniques and some of the artistic things that I've tried to kind of give you some ideas about, what you can do both in camera and in post-processing that will make your image unique and interesting and something different from just pointing your camera at a flower and just clicking the button. Software I use, I use Photoshop, I use Lightroom, I use On1 Perfect Photo Suite, I use Topaz Suite, and I use Luminar. And going back to telling you I'm not a techie, I find 2 or 3 things that I love in all those programs, and I don't have the slightest idea how everything else works in any of those programs. So, but I know what I like, and I know what I want to do, and that's what I learned to do. So in your enthusiasm to put your creative juices to work, don't make images that are over the top saturated that cause unnatural colors, over the top too sharpened, over the top vignetted, or over the top HDR-ish. So don't get stuck in a familiar rut and continue to do only what you did last year. As you are striving to learn and accept new ideas, when you strive to learn and accept new ideas, and try to learn about the new advances in technique and software and gear and methods, your creativity will increase, and your ability will increase to produce unique and fresh and relevant images. And take advantage of classes and workshops, and there's so much you can learn online nowadays, a lot of free stuff you can learn online for sure. And once again, study the images of other photographers. I've written down here some of my favorite flower photographers. You'll look at somebody's flower photography, and any kind of photographer. At some point, you will look at what they've done and you will go, wow, that just blows my mind. And you will not look at your photography that same way ever since. And I've chosen, I haven't looked recently, but as of a little bit ago, all of these photographers post on either Facebook or Instagram or 500 Pixels or Flickr, some of the main websites. And they all have a unique view of flowers. Some are fantasy, some are they are all amazing photographers. And I looked at one of these photographers' photos, and accidentally, it was even kind of before the internet was really big. I saw one of her photos on the cover of a photography magazine, and I just was blown away with it. And that changed my view of flower photography ever since then. Okay, here's some challenges for you. And once again, if you guys want all of these notes, I'm happy to send them to you. Here's a couple of challenges. When you're out shooting, first leave your camera in the bag and look while you look for the flower or the group of flowers that you'd like to photograph. Take your time to observe and study the condition and the details of the flower and look at how the light is hitting the flower. Then start to conceptualize your composition. Walk around it, look at what's unique about it, what's interesting about that flower, and then think about what perspective, angle, or camera settings, or possible post-processing that you could do to make that flower image, a great image. And then finally look through your view camera and take your shot. Another exercise that is equally as interesting to do is choose your flower and then shoot as many different compositions, at least 10, that you can come up with of the same flower, but vary your techniques and your camera settings, and maybe use different lenses if you're using a camera that changes lenses. And then when you're on your computer, use a variety of different post-processing techniques. Really just experiment. And then when you're done, look at all of your images and then find out what techniques, what things worked, and what things that you really liked and ones that didn't. And then the final thing, which is the hardest, is if you've been doing this for a while, go back and critique some of your own images that you created about 4 years ago, 2 to 4 years ago, and see how many you still love and are timeless and relevant, and compare those to how many you look at and say, what was I thinking? And I can tell you, well, maybe you wouldn't be, but for me, it's always shocking because when I've done that, I've looked back and I've thought, oh my gosh, was I really that bad? Or did I really take that picture and think it was great? So this was for my other club. The other club that one of the ones I presented for, they actually are going to have a follow-up meeting where they were going to have all flower season, and then toward the end of summer, we were going to come back online or in person if we can come back in person, and everybody was supposed to bring a couple of their images, and we were going to show and just enjoy people's images, hopefully that they've tried to think about some of these things we've talked about, but they had to images that would work with one or more of these titles, and I've come up with these titles once again to try to get your creative juices flowing. So, Welcome to Fantasyland, Only in My Dreams, Cosmic Creations, Where the Fairies Live, Imagine If, Heaven on Earth, Surreal and Sensual, Moody Blues, Edgy with Attitude, Strangely Abstract, Misty Memories, From Another World, Warm and Fuzzy, Back to the Future, Falling Teardrops. And notice, as I put down the bottom, notice I did not choose boring and ordinary words that you usually use to describe flowers, such as beautiful, colorful, delicate, or romantic. The fun part is to try to come up with a composition that you could title with one of these titles that I put. Okay, I'm done. However, I'm one last thing, and this is it. This is my joke. I have to say, I want to see how smart, if you guys are still there, if you can get this. And I want to go back to this saying, that back to the very beginning, which I still think is the most important part of this whole thing I've been trying to talk to you about. Emotionally full, but technically imperfect, trumps technically perfect and emotionally vacant every time. So I'm going to show you a picture. Here is a picture that has been going around the media sites, the internet, for a long time. It's technically very imperfect. So it's really not a good picture at all. But somehow, and if you remember what I told you about a wow picture, it's got to be something dynamic, something that draws the viewer in, create an emotion, either happy or sad or angry. It's got to do something. And so this picture must have something, because it's gone around the internet forever. So here it is, and you can tell me why this is a wow picture. I'll give you a few seconds to look at it. Whoever can figure that out, unmute yourself and tell the rest of us why this is a wow picture. It's fuzzy, the color is bland, and somebody says this is the worst photographer ever. But why is it still going around the internet? Come on, you guys.
First, there's a lot of women without tops on.
Yeah, there you got it. The photographer took the picture of the bras, and he should have been taking a picture of the naked women. So that's why some man, I'm sure, decided this was the worst photographer ever. So he wasn't really taking a picture of what would have been the most interesting part of this subject, and the technical aspect of it is not so great either. So anyway, that's it. I hope I didn't totally bore you to death, everybody, and hope you picked up a
I
thought
think you
or
took
two.
the best part. This is freedom, not pornography.
Oh. So back to you, Chris. I'm done.
Oh, Karen, thank you. That was amazing. We're all sitting here with our chins down to the floor going,
Oh, wait a minute. I forgot
now
one thing. Wait a minute. I forgot. There we go. If anybody wants my email me and with your email, and I will send you a copy of all my notes.
Perfect. Thanks, Karen. A couple of questions I saw that showed up in the chat. I think you may have answered them, but I'm going to ask them just to make sure. One question was on polarizing filter, and you said you do use that for some of your pictures.
I do.
And
I
another
use it-
question.
I use that actually most always, except on on the really dark and gloomy days, I don't, because polarizers block those ultraviolet rays and makes your colors more vibrant and tones down any bright spots you may have.
Okay. The other question I saw was on lenses, and you did touch on that briefly too.
Yeah,
the
and
different
that
types
was
of
a question
lenses.
that I have a lot. And just to say a little bit on that, somebody asked me what my favorite lens is. And, you know, to be honest with you, I take most of my photos with just a standard lens, just, you know, not a telephoto and not a wide angle. But if I were to choose my second favorite, it's my wide angle lens, because here again, just kind of my signature, I really tend to go with pictures that show a subject flower that is large and kind of takes over the screen. So I just use a standard lens and a wide angle. But obviously, if you're one that wants to do the real close-ups, and to be honest, I have found that as close up as I want to get, you saw that I had a lot of images that had the stamen and the centers with little tiny, you know, little tiny parts to it. And I didn't use a macro lens on most any of those. I just got up as close as my regular lens would focus and took my picture. Then on most of them, I'm able to crop in. If I liked it and I wanted to show I'm able to crop in enough that it actually looks like a macro lens.
Well, Karen, thank you. You've inspired us all.
Well, you are welcome. I hope you all go out and are looking. If nothing else, I hope it gets everybody excited to see some color and I will say, Chris, you know, you can talk to even if we are still on Zoom and that, if your people want to do flowers and want to just even have a show and tell and talk about flowers later at the end of the season, if you're looking for, that would be a, you know, fun thing to do. Then everybody can participate.
Trust me, there will be a photo challenge coming out in the next couple of weeks for spring flowers.
Well, that sounds like a plan.
So we'll play with this, and you've just given us so much to think about. I appreciate your time tonight, Karen.
You are sure welcome. Hope everybody has a great night.
Were there any other questions?
Oh yeah, any other questions? I'm here. Does anybody else have any questions?
I can't think of a question, but I want to say thank you so much. This was wonderful. I love seeing all your photos.
Oh, well,
and you've made me think about what I see in a whole new way.
Well, that was the idea. The idea was to kind of help you be a little more creative as you're looking to compose.
Well, we all want to be like you when we grow up.
Well, that's a nice compliment, but
some of us don't want to grow up though, Karen. So
you're right. That's inferring that I'm grown up, right?
Exactly. Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
Okay, you're so welcome.
Thank you.
Have a great night. This has been recorded, and I will post the link for the recording when we get it. So,
oh, that sounds great.
Good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
Bye. Thanks again. Now I gotta find the